Good morning, good afternoon, Jaipur. Um, as an audience, I think you guys been very spoiled. You have so many amazing writers here, so many amazing books. But I doubt any of us has recently read something as amazing as this book that we're going to talk about this afternoon. When I started reading this book, I was thinking this is an amazing piece of journalism. This is fantastic research. Then I said, no, 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 no. This is not journalism. This is a masterpiece of literature. It reads like a novel. Halfway through, the architect in me thought, this is an amazing piece of forensic architecture. You can't understand the conflict without looking at the map. By the end, you have to shed a few tears when you come to the end of this book. So it is one of the most amazing books, Nathan. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for those very kind words. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you, and especially to be with Ghaith, who is somebody I met many, many years ago. I think it was in 2006 when we first met. And I was barely starting as a reporter. I was coming from Tel Aviv, and I was at the airport in Amman. I had to kind of lie about where I was going to because I was going to Lebanon, and it's an enemy state. You're not allowed to go. And I was a bit frightened about what was going to happen. I'd never been to Lebanon, and I was a young kid, a bit lost at the airport, and Ghaith somehow spotted my vulnerability and took me under his wing, and I sat on the plane with him, and he inducted me into all of the lingo, how we don't say Israel, we say Disneyland, and
I was thinking, please, Allah, don't get another white journalist get kidnapped in Lebanon because I will lose my job. So, Nathan, this is an amazing piece of work. If this book was set in a faraway land, we will still have to read it because it's an amazing work. However, it is set in the most difficult, poignant conflict in our days. We've all seen what's been happening. Can you describe to us this book? In a nutshell, tell me what's this book about?
Yes. You had mentioned forensic architecture. And forensic architecture, for those who don't know, it is an organization that does very in-depth reporting that is really micro-history. And they will take a single event, and by digging very, very deeply into that single event, a single death, a single murder, a single bombing, they will basically unravel a whole history of a place. And that was the aim with this book too, was to take a single event and to tell the whole story of Israel-Palestine through the single event. And the event that I chose was a tragic bus accident that happened in the greater Jerusalem area in 2012. I live in Jerusalem. I live very close to the school that this bus came from. It was filled with kindergartners. They were kindergartners who live in a walled ghetto that's just a couple miles from my home. And they live, of course, on the other side of a 26-foot tall gray concrete wall. They're surrounded on 3 sides by this gray concrete wall and a 4th side by a different kind of wall, which is a wall running through a segregated road, Route 4370, also known as the Apartheid Road. And so these people are completely walled in. They can look up and see the Hebrew University of Jerusalem at Mount Scopus, the most prestigious university in Israel. They can look in the other direction between the spaces between buildings and see a upper middle class Jewish homes inside the settlement of Pisgat Ze'ev. And they have no playgrounds, no sidewalks. They have a single thoroughfare running from one end of this enclave to the other for 130,000 people. That's so narrow, I need to pull in the mirror of my car just to pass a bus when I'm going and visiting some of the people in this story. And I think it's something that we can all relate to. maybe a lot of people here in India can relate to as well, is to live so close to people who live such radically different lives than us, who are living in unbearable conditions right beside us, and how easy it is to ignore that and to be blind to it. So the story I tell is of a group of kindergartners who plan to go on a trip to a play area. And because they had no play area within this walled ghetto, and because they had a complicated permit and checkpoint system that prevented them from going to nearby play areas just on the other side of the wall, they had to get on this bus early one morning in February 2012, very rainy day, and go along the circuitous path of this wall, pass through a checkpoint, and try to reach a play area on the outskirts of Ramallah. But what happened right after they passed this checkpoint was that the bus was struck by a giant semi-trailer. The bus flipped over onto its side. It caught fire. 6 children and 1 teacher died. And because this happened on a road that's used entirely by Palestinians, this scene of a burning bus and people desperately trying to rescue these children was utterly ignored and neglected, such that it was more than 30 minutes before the first Israeli fire truck appeared on the scene. And who was left to deal with this tragedy were ordinary bystanders who pulled over to the side of the road and tried desperately with tiny little fire extinguishers in the trunks of their cars to put out these flames. 2 very heroic people, one of them one of the teachers, and another just a man who lived and worked nearby, entered this burning bus to the shock of all of the people around them. The flames were very high. No one thought a human being could enter those flames. And together they rescued dozens of children, pushing them through the windows and through the back of the bus. And the title of the book is A Day in the Life of Abed Salama. Abed Salama is the name of the father of one of the children on the bus. And Abed found out about this accident. He rushed to the scene. The Israeli army had closed off the road. He wasn't able to pass in the car that his cousin was driving. He hopped out of the car, started running toward the site. He still didn't know if his son was on this bus, if the bus was from his son's school. And he tried to flag down an Israeli army jeep that was heading in his direction. He spoke to the soldiers in Hebrew, saying, "My son is on that bus that was involved in this accident. Can I get a lift?" They refused. He continued running, and he got to this scene, and he saw an enormous crowd and a burned out shell of a bus and no children. And he started to ask people in the crowd, where are the children? And people gave him different answers. They said that they're at one hospital in East Jerusalem, at another hospital in West Jerusalem. They're at the military base, the Israeli military base, a minute up the road. Some are as far as the hospital in Nablus, some are in the Ramallah hospital. And Abed himself, because of the color of ID that he has, a green West Bank ID, because he doesn't have the proper permits, he's not able to go and look for his son at really any of those places except the Ramallah hospital. And he goes there, and yeah.
This is a very good point.
Yes.
The color of the ID card.
Yeah.
Because when we talk about the apartheid road, land grab, what's happening in the West Bank, the map that looks so fragmented, I personally only think of, a entity that took the land and deprived others from its, put them in ghettos, basically. But you describe something very, very important, which is the injustice that is associated with that land grab. What is the significance of an ID card? What's the difference between a blue or a green in that sense of injustice?
Yes. I mean, this book is about the bureaucracy of apartheid. And it is about showing how apartheid actually looks and feels to the people who are navigating this system. And Abed is given a green West Bank ID. There are members of his family who have a blue Jerusalem ID. And also on this, and what that means practically is a very big difference in how you can move in the occupied territories. And those with a blue Jerusalem ID could easily go through the checkpoints to get to the hospitals that Abed was told his son might be at. And in fact, he had to call on relatives who had a different color ID than him to go and look for his son. And the very reason that these children were taken off in different directions to different hospitals is because the people who live in this area have different colored IDs. And some of them had green IDs, some of them had blue IDs, and when a child was rescued from this bus and put in the back seat of somebody's car, the driver of that car, depending on what color ID he had, would go off in one direction or another. If they had a blue Jerusalem ID, the more privileged ID, they would go through the nearby checkpoint to access the superior hospitals that were very close by in Jerusalem. And if they had a green West Bank ID, they wouldn't dream of attempting that, and they went in a different direction. And that's just one tiny layer of this system of control that, you can't actually tell the story of what happened to Abed in those 24, 36 hours looking for his son without explaining this bureaucracy of segregated roads and different colored ID cards and families who are torn apart. And even Abed's, his life, the fact that at a certain point he chooses a marriage partner based on the color of her ID because he has a job in Jerusalem and he's at risk of losing that job. And the only way he and his colleagues could keep this higher paying job in Jerusalem, the city that he was born and raised in, spent his childhood in, the only way he could keep that job was to marry somebody who had a blue ID, and that's not even possible anymore.
Another layer in this amazing book is the wall of separation, apartheid, you name it. And it is not a straight wall, right? It's not like a wall that cuts invisible line between Arabs and Israelis, Arabs and Jews. And there is an intrinsic kind of architecture attached to that wall. And of course, the wall creates more injustices. How did they come up with this whole idea of the wall? And how did they do it?
So one of the principal characters in the book is the architect of the wall.
Abu Kharita.
That's right. The father of the map, whom Arafat called the father of bullshit because the name is very similar, Abu Kharita. And this man is named Danny Tirza. He lives in a settlement. He's a colonel in the IDF. And he had been involved in all of the negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. And he was kind of the expert on topography and map making. And he's really the architect, not just of the wall, but the whole system of dividing up the West Bank the way that it's divided today into what is known as Area A, B, and C. And Area C is more than 60% of the West Bank. It's where all of the settlements are located. It's where every single Israeli base and firing zone, every Israeli natural park, any place you'd find Israelis or Israeli settlers in the West Bank is Area C, and it's contiguous. And within that contiguous 62% of the West Bank that's known as Area C, you have 165 little islands of limited Palestinian autonomy dotted through this sea of total Israeli control. And of course, Israel enters Area A and B, these little islands of limited autonomy, at will. And just to to zoom out for a second, all of the areas of Palestinian autonomy, of varying degrees of Palestinian autonomy, in the area under Israel's control. They all together amount to less than 10% of the territory under Israel's control. So 90% of the territory under Israel's control is directly administered in every respect by Israel. Some of it has been formally annexed, some of it hasn't. But the real difference, and this is one of the key themes of the book, is the real difference is not whether you live in an annexed area or not, because this walled ghetto actually is half annexed. Half of it is, in Israel's view, it's sovereign territory. It's part of the capital of the state of Israel. It's part of Jerusalem. And these people are paying municipal taxes on the other side of the wall and getting no services. But half of this enclave is annexed, half of it isn't, and if you go inside of it, you couldn't tell what's annexed and what isn't annexed. You would need an expert to guide you and tell you where the annexation line is, because it's an area of undifferentiated neglect, and the real difference is not whether you're in an annexed area or not, but whether you're an Arab or a Jew.
Because one of the questions I had when I started reading this book is, how come this town, this ghetto, doesn't have a fire truck or an ambulance car, and why do they need a fire truck coming from the other side?
Yes.
Because that is also part of the injustice you create. You just not only take the land, but you...
Absolutely. And you know, in a way, part of what attracted me to this story was that, you know, I felt that in order to properly tell it, the real chain of causality, if you're really going to dig deeply into what is the real cause of this accident, it is this system of control, and it's a decades-long story. And that was the only way to fully explain what had happened.
As an architect, as a previous architect, I find the way you laid the ground, but also you laid the characters. So how did you do it? How did you have a map? Did you work on a map? Did you have character list? How many millions of hours of interviews? Because this is this book goes from... In the beginning, I was so annoyed with Nathan. It's like, why he's telling me about this guy's previous wife and the grandparent? But as you go into the pages, you realize that nothing happens today. Everything has been happening for decades. Every single choice, from the settlers' choice, the Moroccan settlers' choice of the land where they settle, to the Palestinian marriage choices, it's all been set in motion almost in 1948, basically, or 47.
Yes. Well, thank you. You know, the biggest challenge for this book was exactly what you say, was the structure. It was really the most difficult puzzle that I ever dealt with, was to figure out the structure of this book. And the reason is because I knew that the core of this book, first of all, my ambition for the book was to reach people who didn't know a thing about Israel-Palestine, didn't care about Israel-Palestine, couldn't point to Israel-Palestine on a map. And in order to do that, I knew that the spine of the book had to be a well-told story of this accident, and had to be a tightly paced chronology of what happened basically in that week or in that day with the accident. But I had a secondary and tertiary ambition, which was, to tell the story of apartheid, to explain the system of apartheid, but also to tell the story of Israel-Palestine, to tell the history. And so some characters are very important in the book because of their backstory. There are some of the characters in the book, really, they represent the story of Palestinian exile. And you know, you don't want somebody who enters the book, let's say at 10 a.m. in terms of the story of the accident. Their most important involvement with the accident is at 10 a.m. That's when they have to appear. And you can't have people darting in and out because it's too confusing. You really have to bring in a person, stay with them, and there are only a few key characters that you could allow to come back 50 pages later, and without confusing a reader too much. So, you want, ideally, that the person who comes in at 10 a.m., that their backstory is also 1948, and the person who comes in at 11 a.m., their backstory is the first intifada, and 12, it's the second intifada, but it doesn't work that way. And in fact, somebody's backstory, it's all jumbled.
I mean, two of the characters, and you will do some reading for us. I think one of the characters that Nathan talks about is the person who, in a mad, deranged way, decides to save the children, and he saves a child after another. And then that moment when he starts saying, it's your fault, you didn't send the ambulance. And then he's beaten up. And then he spends 10 days...
By Israeli soldiers.
Yes, yeah. Spent 10 days in a hospital with the kind of the injustices. I would like you to read us that paragraph or the page you were telling me about Salah.
So I'm going to read a short passage from the morning of the accident. And this is the story of a boy named Salah, who was greatly looking forward to this trip, and his mother, Nancy. Her first child, Salah, was born 6 months after her graduation party. Her daughter, Sadine, came 2 years later. Salah was considered exceptionally bright. By the age of 2, he had memorized many more words in English and in Arabic than his peers. When Salah entered kindergarten, Nancy thought he had the mind of a boy of 10 or 11. She decided to send him to Nur al-Huda, that's the name of the school, because it was the best school in the area, and there was no other acceptable choice. She didn't want him to go through the checkpoint each morning, which ruled out the city's public schools, save for the one in the former goat pen. Many of the parents behind the wall felt the same way, spending $1,000 or more per year on private schools like Nur al-Huda. It was the only way to avoid the checkpoint. Nancy always worried about Salah's safety. She was afraid whenever she left him, imagining that he would get lost or fall from a height or suffer some other sort of accident. Perhaps it was because she was so young and he was her first child, but she never felt scared for Sadine. 40 days before the accident, Salah had told Nancy that he was going to die. "I'm going to heaven, and Sadine will be an only child," he said. Nancy responded that he was very young and had a long life ahead of him, but he repeated it nearly every day, torturing his mother. She was so worried that she brought Salah and Sadine to sleep with her, telling them that she wanted to keep them warm in the winter cold. Salah had turned 5 in December. He had a party at home and another at his grandmother's, but he wanted to celebrate at school. The party kept being postponed. Every week it was someone else's birthday. Then the celebration was set for Thursday, February 16th, until the class trip was rescheduled for that date. Nancy said that he would have his party a few days later. I won't have time, he screamed at her. "Either we have the party before or there will be no party." His mother caved, arranging the celebration for the week prior to the trip. He asked his grandmother to come from Atur. That day, she took him shopping for another birthday present. He passed by all the toys in the store and selected a red and blue backpack with his favorite superhero on it, Spider-Man. The parents had to sign a permission slip for the class trip to Kids Land. Azam is the husband, refused to sign because the weather was very bad on the Friday before. Salah was devastated. He cried and begged, saying that he had to be there with his friends. He kept nagging Nancy to sign, and she finally relented on Tuesday morning, with just 2 days to go. At his grandmother's that afternoon, Salah ate za'atar flatbread, which he had asked her to make specifically before the outing. Why before? I'll make it after, she had said. No, he insisted. It has to be before. That night, Nancy bathed him, dressed him in his Spider-Man pajamas, and combed his thick black hair. As he went to sleep, he hugged her again. He hugged her and again said he was going to heaven, leaving her alone with only one daughter. Nancy felt like she was being driven crazy. Why are you doing this to me? She said. The following night, on the eve of the trip, Salah's father got home late. Salah had kept calling him from Nancy's phone, pestering him to come home. He wanted to go and buy treats for the outing. At 9 p.m., Azam took Salah to a corner store, getting him chocolate milk, chips, and assorted candies. Salah packed it all into his new Spider-Man backpack, which he insisted on keeping near him on the bed. He fell asleep, cradling it. It was cold and raining hard in the morning. Azam had already left for work. Nancy stood at the window, wondering how she'd manage to wake Salah up and send him off in this weather. It was usually hard to get Salah out of bed. He'd stay under the sheets until the last possible moment. But this morning he couldn't wait to get out the door. He wouldn't let Nancy put on warm leggings under his gray trousers. He was too excited for even a moment's delay. She wrapped a scarf around his jacket, and together they waited for the bus downstairs. Standing outside with Salah, Nancy felt torn. The weather seemed like anger from God, but Salah was so happy. Nancy gave him 5 shekels to spend at Kidsland. Mama, he said, I love you very much. Then he got on the bus.
I mean, it's heartbreaking, but like a great police detective, Nathan peppers the pages with all these, like a Chekhovian pistols. So the Spider-Man, each one of these lines that he writes will have a significance later. Something very sad happens after the accident and after the children are killed. Some of the Israeli settlers come and pay condolences and try to emphasize that the two communities are sharing the grief. But something else happened, which has significance today with what's happening in Gaza. Some of them celebrate the death of children, Arab children, because one less terrorist alive. How did that happen? How did this? I mean, I know how it happens coming from Iraq, and you see your enemy as an enemy, no longer a Sunni or a Shia. You're just no longer a human being. But how did that happen there in Israel, in that society? Why there was a documentary, I think, made called
An Arab Kid Died, ha 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 ha.
What is that story?
So, on the day of the accident, when Hebrew news sites started to post about this accident that had occurred, a lot of Israelis in the comments section began to write posts celebrating the deaths of these kindergartners. And one of those posts was An Arab Kid Died, ha 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 ha, which was the quote I just mentioned. And there was a television journalist, a liberal Zionist television journalist in Israel by the name of Arik Weiss, and he was horrified actually by what he was seeing. And what was so striking to him was that the people who were posting these celebratory posts, not just on the comments section on news pages, but also on their own Facebook and other social media pages, they were doing it without a pseudonym. They were doing it under their own name. They felt that comfortable celebrating the death of innocent 5-year-olds, and that there would be no repercussions, no social ostracism, that they could do this openly. And so Arik Weiss, the journalist, decided to make a TV documentary, not really about the accident itself, but about the Israeli response to it. His aim, as he says in a voiceover, was to hold up a mirror to Israeli society and ask, how the hell did we get here? And he interviews some of these people who posted celebratory posts, and he finds some of these kids who look like normal, secular Israeli kids at a school in the greater, Tel Aviv area. and they say to him, "I'm proud of what I posted," and they double down on it. And one of them calls over his friends and he says, "What do you think? You know, a group of Palestinian kindergartners dies. Is it good or is it great?" And the friend says, "Well, it's great." And
and that happened 13 years ago.
Yeah.
Tamam. So now we are after a year, almost a year and a half of Gaza, and after all this genocide, destruction, killing, there is such a level of demonization, and it's going both ways. So, is there? I know you hate this word. I hate it too. Hope. Forget the hope. How do we be less pessimistic about it? Is there a way back to a level of humanity that those are people suffering, those are people being killed? Do you think it's possible? Or what are the mechanisms that are used to make us reach this level of demonization of the enemy?
Well, I think that the whole system of control is a dehumanizing system, and it requires a great deal of dehumanization in the first place to do unto others what you would never accept done to you. And so I think that baseline already existed, and we saw it with the celebratory posts with respect to the accident. But now that phenomenon, obviously it doesn't represent all of Israeli society, but that phenomenon has grown tremendously in the last 15 months in particular. And it's gone mainstream, and that is how we have today, you know, the president of Israel, who's regarded as a liberal, saying in effect, there are no innocents in Gaza. I mean, that level of dehumanization is entirely mainstream today, and so I'm a person who has very little hope in that sense, but also just if we take out psychology and emotion and we just look at the structures that are in place, the processes that are in place, you know, what has been happening for the past decades? It's a steady process of expansion of Israeli Jewish territory and constriction of Palestinians into smaller and smaller spaces. And that process is one that is now on steroids. It's not slowing. It's in turbo drive. In the year after October 7th, Israel confiscated more Palestinian land in the West Bank than in the previous 20 years combined. So we're all sitting here as this process is in turbo drive, and you know, you don't need to be a statistician to just look and project forward and see where this is going. And where it's going is a fate for Palestinians like that of the Native Americans, and unless we do something about it.
Because one of the things you were telling me earlier, that the model of Razza, you know, what did you know, kind of putting maximum amount of people within confined space, deprive them of services, deprive them of something, has been tried before, was implemented in these kind of ghettos in the West Bank.
That's absolutely right. You know, the basic principle of Zionist settlement has always been maximum land, minimum Arabs. And so what that means is that Israel in general, with a couple of exceptions, which are East Jerusalem and Hebron, in general, Israel prefers to try to settle sparsely populated areas because it's easier. There's less resistance to it. There are fewer people you've got to push out. And what that has meant is that where you have densely populated Palestinian areas, Israel has taken a different approach, which is not to settle or to put in place slow motion ethnic cleansing, but to basically wall them off, attack from the outside, control from the outside, leave them basically to fester. And Gaza was the prime example of this, a very densely populated place that Israel decided it would control from the outside, and the place where this book is set, in the greater Jerusalem area, which, by the way, is the heart of the settlement project. More than half of Israeli settlers live in the greater Jerusalem area. It's the number one priority area for Israel because it is how you prevent a Palestinian state from ever arising, is by ensuring that there is a large Jewish presence all around Jerusalem. And what happened in this community of erecting these walls, surrounding these people by walls, going in only, the Israeli authorities going in not to provide services, but only going essentially as a military force to go and make arrests or to disperse crowds or to destroy buildings that were built without permits. That is a model just like Gaza, and it's replicated elsewhere in the West Bank. This is the basic system, is where there aren't a lot of Palestinians, you settle and you take over. Where there are, you wall it off and you control from the outside.
I mean, it's a very, very cheerful book. Please, do read it. Seriously, I mean, one of the frustrating things, I know we have 5 minutes for questions, but one of the things that we were talking about earlier, which frustrates me, when I was in Lebanon last year and this year, and you see what's been happening, for example, and you read about it's been happening in 58, 67, 71, 79, this repetitiveness, and it's always have a military solution without a political solution in the end. So that is where kind of how frustrating it is. Please, questions. Oh, mashallah, mashallah. The lady in the front row, and then the gentleman next to her. Oh.
Nathan, thank you so much. This is absolutely a privilege to listen to you today here. And I wish it had been the weekend, because you deserve that famed standing packed audience at Jaipur. But my question was, it's hypothetical because currently there's still a tenuous ceasefire, very tenuous. But to zoom out a bit and ask two very big picture questions.
One question.
They're related. One is, how will we rebuild Gaza if we get the chance? And two, how will we deal with the generational trauma that has just been created?
Thank you. We'll take the questions and then answer them.
At a subconscious level, do you think the Israelis are behaving the way the Nazis behaved towards them in the Second World War? Are they aware of it, or are they not aware of? They are doing the exact same thing.
Thank you. I think your name is Rana Effendi, right?
Hi, Nathan. I overheard you saying, unless we do something about it. And I want to ask you what can be done. I mean, we have now ICC warrant for the arrest for the war crimes, but there's a high degree of futility to all these efforts, and I want to hear your thoughts on that, on the futility.
One more question. In the back, the lady in the back.
In the UK and in North America, in terms of the reporting of what has happened to the Palestinian people, the use of the word apartheid, or in the case of Gaza, the use of the word genocide, is either actively avoided or constantly rebutted. I'd be very interested to know what your thoughts are on why that exists and what impact it's having on public perception, particularly in Europe and North America.
Thank you. So, the trauma, rebuilding Gaza, the futility, apartheid, and that Nazi.
Yeah. I'll start with the last one. There are a couple of different things happening at once. One is that these words that there is great resistance to in Western media and Western institutions are gaining traction, and part of the greatly increased effort to label criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic is kind of Israel's silver bullet. It's the last, they've run out of arguments, and so it's the last thing they have left to try and counter what people are rightly perceiving to be a system of domination with the intent of maintaining that system, namely apartheid. And so, I'm actually hopeful with respect to that. I do think that I see progress there, and I think we will continue to see progress there. And the reasons why are obvious. The whole, Western world is pro-Israel and incredibly biased against Palestinians. Rebuilding Gaza, who knows if Gaza will be rebuilt. We don't know if this ceasefire will hold. There are members of this Israeli government who are saying explicitly that they have no intention of implementing the second phase of this ceasefire. And even if it does hold, who knows if Gaza is going to be rebuilt, and even if it's a fourth of what it was prior to October 7th in 15 years, that's an optimistic scenario.
How do you deal with the trauma of this? Do you think there is hope? Do you think trauma can be dealt with?
I think that, that there was a question about how Israelis perceive what they're doing, and I think that the real answer is that there's a tremendous amount of denial. There's tremendous denial of what Israel is doing to the Palestinians, both in Gaza in the last 15 months, but also to Palestinians in general, to the story of the creation of Israel, the story Israelis tell themselves about Zionism, the story they tell themselves about the whole history of the place is filled with denial. And so I think that's really the fundamental thing. There is much more discussion in the Israeli press of analogies to the Second World War. That's something that's outlawed in much of the Western press, but it's something that you do see appear from some brave Israeli journalists, one of whom is in the front row here.
And a big shout out to Gideon. Futility of the ICC, do you think kind of issuing arrest warrants, any of these things can have an impact?
I think that, look, there are two timelines. One is the timeline that I'm describing of this slow motion ethnic cleansing, this process of Israeli Jewish expansion, Palestinian constriction, and the fate of Palestinians looking like that of Native Americans. That process is moving very rapidly. The other process are these tiny little baby steps towards accountability that we're seeing right now. And it's just moving far too slowly for me to have any hope that that is a real force on the horizon that's going to stop the first process. So when I talk about, it's up to us to make sure that it's much more than those baby steps. It's up to us to make sure that our governments are not supporting this slow motion ethnic cleansing.
Nathan, thank you so much. Thank you for writing this book.
Thank you.
Thank you.